I wanted to share a little bit about the Core 7 and why does that even exist and where did it come from and how did I get, what are the things that are included in it and why did I write a whole book about it? And so, backstory on me, when I started Pomelo, my goal was not to create a firm that I would work with coffee roasters. That wasn't my goal at all. And my thought was, oh, I'll just help roasters make more money and improve their operations. And I knew I could help them with the things that trip them up. That's probably how I would have phrased it at that point too. And what I learned over time was that that really wasn't good enough. And I needed to have a framework for how I worked with clients. What do I even do with a client? What does it mean for a client to work with me, to work with Pomelo as a company? And I needed to formalize some of those things, but I didn't know that at the time, because when we go back a little over 4 years ago, when I left Metric in Chicago, I started getting requests from coffee roasters that I had met along my journey, and they were asking me, hey, can you help me with this project? Can you help me build a sales process? Can you evaluate my pricing? And over time, what I learned was there's a pattern of things that are challenges for roasters. And so I started to observe these things, and then I started to realize maybe I should charge for this because I'm creating value for these coffee roasters. Maybe I need to charge for the work that I'm doing. And at the same time, I was running the Levco, which is a design firm that I ended up closing in 2025 to focus on Pomelo. And when I started the firm, my dad had asked me if I would meet with his friend Don. And your fridge and your pantry are full of the items that these companies make that he consults on. And so, of course, I said, yes, I would love to meet with Don and hear kind of how does Don do the work that he does? How does he approach what he's doing? And in our meeting, he asked me a very pointed question. And he said, what is your framework, your process? How do you approach working with clients? And I said a version of what I just shared with you. I knew I could help. I knew I could make sure that the businesses were making money. I knew that I could provide value, but I didn't have a framework for how I approached the work that I was doing. And he asked me if I wanted to see the framework that he uses. And I said, please. This is a virtual meeting. So he points to his computer and he pulls up his deck. And the way that he described it was that when you work with a client, imagine there's a house. And there's different rooms in the house, and clients need to know what room they're in so they know that, well, this room needs to be repainted, this one needs to be taken down to the studs, and this one, we need to take out this wall and make it one big room so that they know where they're at in the process. And so that began the journey for me of defining what are the things that I can help with and what is the framework that I'm going to use to work with clients. So over the next few years, what I did was I started to compile a list of what are all the things that a coffee roaster needs. And I added things and I subtracted things and I tried to synthesize things. And I mentioned this person, I believe in the book, their name is David C. Baker. And what they do is they recommend a process called drop and give me 20. And it's essentially just think about your clients and go through and write 20 different things, 20 different questions, 20 different challenges that your clients face regularly. So the drop and give me 20 process was also a part of defining what is the core 7, what is included in it, and where's their overlap, and are there things that I'm missing, and what do I need to include? The journey began there of determining, okay, what is the absolute number one thing that every coffee roaster needs? And it's sales. That's the first core of the core 7, which is the framework that I use when I work with clients. My reason for that being the first one is that without sales, you have a hobby. You don't have a business. And so we need to make sure we understand sales. And also, the other thing that I noticed too is the roasters that I would work with that had found success had also figured out how to do sales and do them effectively. And so my thesis was, okay, we need to make sure sales is the thing we figure out first. We got to figure out, how are we going to sell this thing? Then product. And we talk about green coffee later in the course, but product was really important because we need to know what are the things that we're selling that are not coffee, and how do they support the first core, which is sales? How do we make sure that the things, if we're going to sell coffee, we should probably sell filters so that the people who buy your coffee can also buy your filters from you. And that way you become more than just a vendor, you become a resource to them that's providing more than just coffee. Next, we talk about cash management. How do we think about cash? How do we make sure we're making money? What do we do with excess? How do we plan for excess? What does the structure of our budgets look like? Then we talk about green coffee and how do we think about green coffee? Where do we find it? How do we structure our green coffee program? Is QC important? What does that look like? Then the fifth core is roastery operations, which is how the thing functions. How do we actually roast and sell coffee? How do we get coffee from green in the back door to roasted and out the front door for delivery? Number 6 is people. And this is a really important one because if you run a business of any scale, you're going to have to hire people. You need to lead people and you need to have a structure for how you're thinking about your people specifically, because while the business is yours, they are a key element of the success of your business and what your business feels like out in the world, because they are representing your business to the world. And lastly, we have wholesale, because almost every roaster I work for has some amount of wholesale business, and even most of them actually have a significant portion of their business is wholesale. Not all of them, but some of them are. And so we go through, how do we structure that, and how do we think about not just selling coffee, but becoming a strategic partner and a co-conspirator in the success of our accounts. So those are the core 7, and that was sort of the building of the core 7 and why I structured it that way and why they sort of build on one another. And then as I've gone through the last few years of working with clients, it's been very interesting to see how when we apply this framework to roasters that are growing or roasters that are at different places in their life cycle, when we apply these structures, it's very easy to see, okay, this area here, the product is not sorted out, or the green coffee, how we buy green coffee is not sorted out, or how we're doing sales is not sorted out. And so using this framework allows me as a consultant to be able to clearly see and articulate where the challenges are in a business and be able to very easily diagnose, there's a challenge here. We need to solve this before we move forward. We cannot pass go until we figure out, what does our wholesale program look like and how do we define that? The last thing I'll say about the core 7 is this. When I was doing creative work with the Levco, one of my heroes, Blair Inns, talks about how the way you get repeatable results is having a process for how you do what you do. And oftentimes consultants get somewhat of a bad name because oftentimes there's not a ton of structure around what we're doing. And I wanted to go the opposite direction. I wanted to have a clear process that is somewhat public in terms of, this is how I would approach every roaster. And that is the core 7. And it's no secret that when I am engaged by a roaster, I'm going to do a diagnostic assessment, which is going to walk you through your entire business top to bottom. And I'm looking at your business through the lens of the core 7. I'm looking at your business through the lens of how healthy is this in relation to your sales, your product, your cash management, your roastery operations, your people. And it's very important for my clients to understand that we're not just making assumptions. There's a process to how we're approaching these things. It was really interesting. I was working with a client. This was like 3 years ago, and I was just formulating the Core 7 and getting it to a place of where I was like feeling pretty comfortable with it. And I had taken a client through the first core, which was sales. And then we started talking about product. And then we started talking about cash. And by the fourth core, the client looks at me and goes, "Oh, you have a plan for what you're doing here." And I was like, "Yeah, of course. I'm not just pretending and hoping that we find something. There's a process to this. There's a structure, and it's repeatable, and it's not guaranteed, of course, because there's outside factors that I'm not in control of, but there is a process and there is a structure for how we're going about this, and it is repeatable because we do the same things every time." And yes, the application is different. And it's sort of like a doctor, right? When you think of a doctor, you go to a doctor and they have seen the same ailments, but sometimes the solution or the medicine or the remedy for that ailment might be different for different people because, shoulder pain. Does that mean that every person that has a shoulder pain needs aspirin? Or maybe some people actually need to just work that arm out more, or maybe somebody needs surgery. The application may be different and specific to the client, but how we diagnose and how we determine what is healthy, what is within range of good and bad, and within appropriate benchmarking, that is relatively static. And the application is where we get to have some creativity, and we work together with the client to determine what's best for you in this situation versus a copy and paste approach. So that's the Core 7. That's why we approach things that way, because we've just seen that when you take a methodical approach towards understanding the business, understanding your goals, and articulating what is healthy, what is maybe broken, what is also working really, really well, and then getting to application, we get to be very creative with the owner of the business and the people that we're working with within the business to determine, okay, how do we find the right solution for your desired outcome? And that's why we have the Core 7. It's a framework that gives us a way in which we approach our work, a way in which we approach clients, and then the application is where it's unique to each individual business. Hope that's helpful. Thanks for listening. Be well.